Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive interviews with leading experts every weekday here on Al Arabiya News. I'm Tom Burges Watson. Coming up on today's program, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is in Washington as the first foreign leader to visit President Trump since his return to the White House. A key topic of discussion, the ceasefire in Gaza, which President Trump says he's unsure will actually hold. US-funded humanitarian programs across the globe face an uncertain future as President Donald Trump orders an overhaul of almost all foreign aid. Elon Musk has been tasked with slashing spending by the US Agency for International Development. And sighs of relief in Canada and Mexico as President Trump holds off on the 25% tariffs he'd threatened would take effect today. This after both countries agreed to crack down on immigration and drug smuggling. Hello and welcome to the program. President Donald Trump has ordered an overhaul of almost all US foreign aid, and he has tasked Elon Musk with reviewing and cutting expenditure by the US Agency for International Development. But the freezing of US aid funds is expected to have a devastating impact for many thousands of people across the world. Well, President Trump has signed an executive order pausing almost all international spending for 90 days. Well, the US spent around $68 billion on international aid in 2023. Most of that money was directed towards projects in Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa and Europe. Well, US aid has also provided more than $2 billion in aid to Gaza since the 7th of October 2023. Well, the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio says that future US aid projects must be aligned with American foreign policy.
So the functions of USAID, there are a lot of functions of USAID that are going to continue, that are going to be part of American foreign policy, but it has to be aligned with American foreign policy. And this is not my frustration. This frustration has existed now for almost a quarter century in multiple administrations that have gone through this challenge. It's going to stop and it's going to end. There are things that it does that are good, and there are things that it does that we have strong questions about. It's about the way it operates as an entity. And they're supposed to take direction from the State Department, policy direction. They do not. Not only do they not take policy direction, they're completely uncooperative.
The US Secretary of State speaking there. Meanwhile, Democratic lawmakers are expressing alarm.
This is not some minor transgression. This is an illegal act. They stormed into buildings. They shut down agencies illegally. And sure, first it was USAID. But they are now systematically going into the Small Business Administration, the Department of the Treasury, and they will not stop until they believe they have total control over spending.
Okay, well, let's cross now to London. We can speak to Greg Swenson, Chair of Republicans Overseas UK. Thank you very much indeed for joining us once again here on Al Arabiya News. What's your understanding of what the future holds for US aid?
Yeah, I think it will be a much improved USAID. I think that, these changes are needed, as the prior comments suggested. I think they're needed all across Washington and the bureaucracy. So this was just one of the first of many of these bureaucratic departments that really needs to be cleaned up. But I think that the core purpose of USAID will continue, and it'll be a better agency for it.
So why do you think there needs to be such a significant review of US foreign aid?
I think there's a few reasons, Tom. First of all, that there's no real clear understanding of who's making decisions and where this money goes. So much of it is untraceable. And as Marco Rubio pointed out, they have not been cooperative for a long time, for at least 2 decades. So I think that's important that there's got to be accounting, because there's just so much waste. The second point is, as the Secretary of State pointed out, we have to make sure that these are aligned with the national interest. The statute says it must be aligned with policy directives from the State Department, from the National Security Council, and from the president. And it does not appear that many of those, or at least, in certain administrations, were not consistent with policy. And I'll just give you an example of some of the waste. And I think this is the third point, that people are just appalled with government waste. That's one of the reasons President Trump was elected. But, $32,000 for a trans comic book in Peru, $2.6 million for a DEI training in Serbia. Those are the kind of things that really are disappointing to hear from the voters. And that's, again, why President Trump has a real, kind of a tailwind to do this kind of stuff.
Okay, but obviously some really worthwhile organizations are really going to suffer, aren't they? And it could mean that, for example, the lives of women who are pregnant in Afghanistan, people who are dependent on HIV treatments in South Africa, they're going to pay a heavy price, aren't they?
I don't think so, because I think the secretary was very clear, and this goes back, 2 weeks when these directives first started coming out about cutting off all spending. They did that for a very deliberate reason, because there was just so much unaccountable money going out the door, and they wanted to stop that. But he said immediately, any important function that's going to save lives there'll be waivers, and that can be done very quickly. And I'm sure it's been done already since day one. So the intention here is not to cut off aid that saves lives, aid that is supporting people in distress, the so-called safety net. This is to stop the things like I mentioned, $70,000 for Irish DEI musical and a $47,000 for a trans opera in Colombia. This stuff just makes no sense, and again has nothing to do with the policy of the United States. Whereas saving people in countries that are in a difficult situation, that is part of the foreign policy of the United States. That is good to have that kind of presence in that part of the world.
Elon Musk described USAID as a, quote, criminal organization. Don't you think that's going a bit far?
Yeah, I think so. I think, Elon Musk is kind of a, provocative. He's a disruptor, obviously. And so, he's going to have a different way about him. I thought the way the Secretary of State explained it was much more filtered and much more intelligent in many ways. But, again, voters voted for the bull in the china shop. They want President Trump to be aggressive. They want him to be disruptive. And Elon Musk is very similar to President Trump in that way. So unfortunately, they've tried the polite way for 2 or 3 decades, and it just hasn't worked. So now they're going in a lot more aggressively. Sometimes it's distasteful, sometimes it's unfiltered, but in many cases that's refreshing, given the frustration of the voters and $36 trillion in debt, 8 trillion of which came in the last 4 years.
There are a lot of people who are worried about what sort of a message this sends out to the world about what kind of a partner, what kind of an ally the United States is. Iran has been joking in state media, saying that the United States is treating its allies like, quote, disposable tissues, they said. I mean, this does raise some issues, doesn't it, about the trust and reliability of the US as a partner?
Yeah. Well, of course, and I think, of course, that would come from Iran, and it probably is coming from North Korea and Russia as well. But I think, we have to keep in mind that the system is broken, and it's better for the world if the U.S. is in a powerful position and fiscally healthy, so we can continue being the most generous country in the world and continue defending the West and basically defending the world from adversaries. And so, we can't do that. The United States can't do that if we're in a fiscal crisis, which we are in right now. So this in many ways just fixes a broken system, makes it better so that we can provide not only aid, but we can provide defense and security and free and safe shipping lanes for the next generation.
So people out there who say, aid is a key part of building alliances around the world, and in the absence of that US aid, the void will be filled by China and Russia in developing countries in particular. What would you say to them?
Well, I mean, look, I think it's okay for people to be worried, because this system is not sustainable the way it is. So I understand that. But I think what they have to keep in mind is yes, there could be gaps filled by adversaries, but those gaps will not be terribly open. In other words, the critical aid will continue. I think it's important, but in many ways, aid in the long run is a failure. All you're doing is putting a Band-Aid on the problem. What's really worked better is sustainable development. And that's why President Trump doubled the balance sheet of the U.S. Development Financial Corp in his first term. And he saw that that the Chinese were the Belt and Road was being quite competitive and quite aggressive in sub-Saharan Africa, in parts of Asia. And so, U.S. development is not just aid and charity. It should be something that's sustainable. And that's why they go in, building infrastructure, building out agriculture, food processing, energy, of course, most important. 500 million people in Africa still don't have electricity. And so the United States has been really aggressive about that, especially in Trump's first term, in bringing power and electricity and clean water to sub-Saharan Africa and other difficult places. That's going to continue. And I think it's just better, again, to fix the broken system, make sure that aid is not just going to frivolous projects like the ones I listed, or aid's going into the pockets of generals, or the food is being distributed, by gangs in places like Gaza. So much of that food didn't reach its intended recipients. So I think there's many occasions and many places where we can fix the system. And that's what we're really trying to do. This is not cutting off aid to the world. It's making it more efficient.
Sure. So those people who are saying, this is a great gift to countries like Belarus and Iran, Nicaragua, North Korea, where, for example, USAID money is being used to finance pro-democracy programs, you'd say, look, this is uncomfortable. It's an audit. No one likes an audit, but everything will be better in a couple of months from now. Is that roughly how you'd sort of sum it all up?
Yeah, that's a great way to put it, Tom. And I think if you take some of that money that's being wasted, either put it back in the taxpayer's pocket or put it toward things that are constructive, like looking after pregnant women in Afghanistan, for sure. Those things will work. And again, some of the things you mentioned, like democracy support in countries like Nicaragua, those are things that are very well aligned with U.S. foreign policy and the national interest. So, I think those kind of programs will continue. But I think you've probably seen the last of, trans comic books in Peru. I think those days are pretty numbered.
USAID is going to be overhauled by someone by the name of Peter Morocco, who perhaps not all our international viewers will be aware of. He's a former US Marine, a conservative activist from Dallas. He described USAID, by the way, as being run by radical left lunatics. I'm just wondering what his qualification is for that job.
Yeah, I mean, look, I don't know him personally. I think anybody who's had military experience, the military's been one of the great institutions at delivering aid to people and looking after people in distress. And you saw that in Iraq and Afghanistan, in spite of the problems in both of those countries. But the humanitarian effort by the U.S. military was incredible. So, yeah, I think having veterans in those positions can be really productive. I think, saying that they're run by lunatics, okay, maybe that's a little aggressive, but, in my experience with aid, there's a lot of good people. We do a lot of work with USAID, my firm in Africa, and there are a lot of good people, but there's a lot of people that are just going to conferences, congratulating each other and kind of spreading this woke ideology around the world. And that is clearly not aligned with the national interest.
And just lastly, I mean, this is just one case study of the Trump administration doing something that looks and sounds quite painful and is obviously upsetting a lot of people, not least the people whose jobs are affected in Washington and indeed much further afield as well. Is there an argument, perhaps the Trump administration, it's 2 weeks old as an administration, is being a little bit heavy-handed here, and there might be a better way of doing things? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, we've tried the more subtle way for generations now, and it just hasn't worked. And then while we're doing that, the government bureaucracy gets more bloated. So the regulatory state just gets larger, which makes it more difficult for people and businesses to function. And so I think we got to the point, and this is, again, one of the reasons that President Trump won the elections comfortably, is that people are just fed up with it. And so the voters have sent a signal that these bloated bureaucracies have to be fixed. Bringing a private sector mentality to Washington will be really productive. It will make Washington better. And then these aid programs like USAID and development programs like USDFC will be much improved. And that will be better for the world and better for our allies. And so, that's important to keep in mind. A private sector mentality, yes, people lose their jobs. That's too bad. It happens to the best of us in the private sector. It's just real life. But I think if that mentality works in Washington, you'll see a really successful improvement in the bureaucracy there.
Okay, well, we really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us as ever. Greg Swenson, Chair of Republicans Overseas at UK. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Tom.
Well, let's get more now. We can speak to Matthew Kavanagh, Director for the Center for Global Health Policy and Politics at Georgetown University, who joins us now from Washington. Thank you very much indeed for being with us. What's your understanding of what the future holds for USAID? On the one hand, we're being told it's going to be shut down altogether. On the other hand, we're being told that it's going to go through some pretty radical reforms, but continue to exist in a different form. What's your understanding?
So I don't think we're exactly sure. There's a lot of chaos right now around kind of what is the future of the agency. It's important to remember that USAID was chartered by Congress. It's an established organization, an agency within the US government, and it actually does not, the president doesn't have the ability and the legal authority to just abolish it. And so what you heard yesterday was Secretary Rubio saying that he is now the head of USAID and that their plan is to bring it inside of the US government or of the US State Department and perhaps abolish parts of it, perhaps keep other parts of it. It's really deeply unclear, and it's actually set up a major constitutional challenge for the Congress and the presidency at this point.
We've just been speaking to a guest who said that the USAID is extremely wasteful. He says millions of Americans take issue with some of the projects that are being funded by it. And he says it's time that it became a private sector style entity and a little bit more accountable. What do you say to that?
I think that's a ridiculous critique. The core of USAID is funding to some of the most important issues around the world, to some of the most disadvantaged communities around the world. There are, of course, ways that USAID could be shifted or made better, but the vast majority of USAID funding goes to things like fighting pandemics, stopping disease, feeding hungry people. These aren't corrupt, these aren't problematic, these aren't wasteful. These are interventions in the world from the richest country in the world, totaling less than 1% of the total budget, that actually go to both support a variety of US priorities, but also to do a lot of humanitarian good. This is exactly what the private sector is unable to do. This is about providing public goods in a world of chaos, in a world of inequality. And so those kinds of critiques just make no sense. They carry no water.
I mean, this administration in Washington is just 2 weeks old. And, we're trying to sort of feel our way slightly in the dark as to, just to what extent they're going to come good on promises and threats. But there does seem to be an element of, create a lot of drama around an issue, a lot of discussion and debates, with some method, I should say, in that technique. And in the end result isn't quite as dramatic as everyone fears it might be. I mean, do you think that might ultimately end up being the case with USAID, that's just going to be in for a major review, but it's not ultimately going to be shut down?
We'll see. I mean, I think it's a valid question of kind of what of this is just bluster and blunder. A lot of the information that's being shared is simply false. Recently, the White House secretary for the press was telling everyone that there was $50 million in condoms going to Gaza, and that was an excuse for why they really had to review everything. Well, there was no $50 million worth of condoms going to Gaza. That was just fiction. So a lot of what is circulating is made up, facts with a tiny bit of truth that are not actually what they appear, and a lot of things that are just disingenuous. So the core question is, why is this administration attacking aid programs this way? What we know is that right now, the freeze that's been put on aid programs is having hugely disastrous impact. People aren't getting HIV treatment. People aren't getting HIV prevention. There are lives being lost right now because the administration has paused all aid. This isn't like a business. You can't run it like a business. This is life-saving work. And so stopping it right now is having deeply damaging effects. But what we also know is that part of what this administration is trying to do is to sow some level of chaos because that's a way to gain power. And so right now they've put all of the kind of leadership of USAID on leave. They've decided that it's going to move over to the US State Department. They've set up a whole bunch of major challenges. What if that will come to fruition is an interesting question. Actually, the courts are now weighing in. They've actually put a temporary restraining order on the freeze on funding. And I wouldn't be surprised at all if the courts actually stop the transfer of USAID into the State Department because it very directly violates US law. And so the question is, what level of this is real? And what level of this is an attempt to sow chaos and to kind of, create power building? And then a third option is also out there, which is what portion of this is the administration trying things out in the aid sector, because they know that the aid sector is less politically powerful than others, where they try to really attack the civil servants, really attack the US government structures that move things forward. And if they can do it in USAID, maybe they can also do it in other parts of the US government. That's the one that actually worries me the most.
Yeah, I mean, all of this must feel very real to, as you use as an example there, those people getting HIV prevention services and treatments. For example, in South Africa, there was the manager of one clinic that provides life-saving treatment to 6,000 people, who's quoted as saying, "The US is a totally unreliable partner. The system is entirely volatile and chaotic." I mean, the other thing is that by reversing progress on something like HIV/AIDS, which had been a global pandemic at one stage, actually could boomerang back and affect the United States, couldn't it?
That's right. And there are right now 122 different emergency health events that are going on around the world. There's an outbreak of Marburg virus in Tanzania. There's Ebola virus that's just broken out since the president was inaugurated in the Democratic Republic of Congo and in Uganda. In Bolivia, we've got a new hemorrhagic fever. There's a wide variety of things that are going on. And we've got the continuing AIDS pandemic that's having 3,000 people every day infected. Interrupting these programs, deciding that the US is going to halt them, doesn't just hurt millions and millions of people around the world, but it also makes the US less safe. The broad consensus around global health is that there has to be a kind of collective effort to stop the pandemics of today, to halt the pandemics of the future. All of that is work that takes money, but it actually takes a tiny bit of money for the world's richest countries. And so playing around with this is playing around with fire. The administration, the last Trump round of this, got the COVID-19 response incredibly bad, incredibly wrong. They were unable to stop the virus, and they used a whole bunch of policy tools that were deeply inappropriate. And so now they're coming after the agencies that actually showed just how inappropriate their COVID response was, out of, I think, a sense of vendetta to some degree. But it's incredibly short-sighted, because it means that as these next pandemics happen, they will grow and grow, and that's going to affect not just people around the world outside the United States, but people inside the United States who are looking at bird flu, who are looking at an outbreak of tuberculosis. The world is interconnected, and this administration can try to pretend it's not, but they won't succeed.
Sure, and you mentioned there in what ways this poses a threat to the United States from the point of view of diseases, pandemics, and such like. There's also an argument that's being put out there, and I'd like you to help us understand this, that by defunding or dismantling USAID, it somehow undermines US security goals. What's the argument? What's the thinking there?
So the broad understanding in the foreign policy community is that there are multiple ways to achieve, diplomatic goals. Some are through hard power, some are through direct negotiation and diplomacy. But a lot can be achieved through soft power. And that is the essence of what USAID does, for better or for worse. I think there are some very strong critiques, actually, of the ways that the US has used USAID in ways that I think are neocolonial and really are problematic in terms of the way it works. But there's also absolute truth to the reality that funding HIV treatment and keeping people alive around the world has brought massive goodwill to the United States. That actually ensuring that the US is one of the responders to disasters when they happen, to crises like cyclones and earthquakes, that is a basic responsibility of a major power in the world. And so that brings the U.S. a wide variety of positive, positive energy, positive political shine, and it advances the idea that a more stable world is one in which the United States benefits dramatically. And so all of that is the mission of USAID. So as we have the Elon Musks of the world going out, not understanding how the world diplomacy works, not kind of seeing the bigger picture, and instead picking out little bits and then lying about them, it's deeply problematic, right? The White House just posted a list of terrible things that they found, and most of them are not particularly terrible, right? Supporting, ensuring that there is greater understanding in the Balkans is probably a good idea for a post-genocidal society. So the kinds of things that this administration is pointing out and how small and kind of ridiculous they are actually just show how little critique there actually is for the U.S. Agency for International Development. My hope is that will be reversed. We've got folks in the Senate and in the U.S. Congress who really do understand the ways in which USAID serves U.S. interests. And my guess is that they are going to have some serious checks on whether or not the president can do the most radical things. But that's going to be up to this Congress, which, of course, is now united behind the Republican Party. And that means that the opposition to it is much weaker than it might otherwise be. But even among Republicans, there's a sense that this is a bad foreign policy decision.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for your time today, Matthew Kavanagh. Thanks again.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Now, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has arrived in Washington, making him the first foreign leader to visit President Donald Trump since he returned to the White House. Well, this visit comes as negotiations begin for the second phase of the ceasefire deal in Gaza. Well, President Trump had previously expressed that he had no assurances that the ceasefire would actually hold, unlike his Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff, who sounded more optimistic. Witkoff says that he is hopeful that President Trump will secure the release of more hostages and, in his words, save lives. Well, at the negotiating table, Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu won't just be discussing the ceasefire. They're also expected to be discussing the future of Gaza and its people. Well, for more analysis, we can speak now to Thomas Pickering, former US ambassador to Israel, who joins us from Virginia in the United States. Thank you so much for joining us once again, Ambassador Pickering. There were some pretty tense relations at various stages between the Israeli Prime Minister and the Biden White House. Does this visit to the Trump White House symbolize to you a reset for Israeli-American relations?
I think that we will wait to see the results of the meeting this afternoon to make that determination, but it indicates an interest in President Trump's finding a way to bring along Prime Minister Netanyahu with his effort to end the conflict and his effort to bring home hostages, both of which he has continued to make a central focus of what he wishes to do. Linked with this are deep concerns about nuclearization in Iran and constant reports of the Iranians making progress toward developing a nuclear weapon on the one hand, and on the other hand, a deep concern by President Trump about the possibility, indeed, of setting up a closer link between Saudi Arabia and perhaps other Gulf countries and Israel as part of an effort to find a way to end conflict. And some of the difficulties that are engaged in that, one being basically, will he put Mr. Netanyahu in a position where he adopts policies which will make him vulnerable in the Israeli political and security scene to retribution and examination and investigation as a result of Hamas's military attack on Israel and the devastation on October 7th, which it caused? Will it also open the door to deep American concerns about the death rate among Palestinians in Gaza? Over 46,000 reported so far.
Indeed, and you raise a lot of important points there, Ambassador. But just sort of going back to the basics surrounding this state visit, I mean, the first foreign leader to be hosted by President Donald Trump since his inauguration. I mean, that sends out quite a strong message to the rest of the world, doesn't it?
It sends out a signal, obviously, that President Trump is seriously interested in Middle East, hopefully, as he says, in Middle East peace and the end of conflict, and dealing with the myriad linked questions that I've just gone over with you, which are important because the sense is that there's no silver bullet yet in sight, although we will see in the meeting whether President Trump's mastery of the art of the deal is beginning to have an effect on Prime Minister Netanyahu, up to including the question of how and in what way he will be prepared to make necessary sacrifices to bring about the compromises that President Trump has clearly put as the necessity on the table, particularly to end the conflict and return hostages.
Do you think it's correct to describe the Trump administration as being staunchly pro-Israeli, or would you say that was a mischaracterization?
I think that you can say that they're deeply committed to Israel, but they also have other questions in mind, one of which philosophically is current Israeli policy with respect to the continued conflict in Gaza, bringing Israel into a situation of quite serious disrepute among wide numbers of members of the international community on which it has previously depended for support, not just the United States.
In terms of what happens next with regards to the ceasefire process, we understand that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is going to be sending a delegation to Doha this week as the negotiations there continue. Just where are we in this process of negotiating a ceasefire with Hamas? And
I think we're at the beginning of the beginning, if I can phrase it that way, and that we know, in fact, that getting to the first agreement was extremely hard, and part of that was how to outline or set the agenda for the second agreement. That's now having to be addressed, and bringing the Israeli delegation to Qatar, which happened over the weekend and was the work apparently of President Trump's negotiator, is a positive forward step, but not the full answer, obviously, to the question of how and in what way can the big issues that lie in wait for that particular process be resolved. The resolution of the president is clear. He's made it clear, and that will have some serious standing with the Israelis, and will be one of the questions that he will look to as being perhaps facilitated by the invitation and the arrival of Prime Minister Netanyahu here as the first of his state guests.
Yeah, and of course, we heard President Donald Trump, even before he became president, taking quite a lot of credit for that ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas. Do you think that adds a sense of obligation to the visiting Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to perhaps respect that ceasefire and make sure that it goes down in history as having been a success?
If you believe, as some do, and which I'm inclined toward, that Prime Minister Netanyahu wishes to remain in office and in charge and the master of Israeli policy about going ahead as an important condition of his avoiding what is clearly something of concern to many people, that he be investigated and looked at in terms of any responsibility he might have for the events of October 7th, or the failure of Israel to anticipate and deal with those events. And that remains very much out there as something that people will want to pay attention to as Prime Minister Netanyahu pays attention to it.
Just with regards to some of the things we've heard from the Trump administration, which is only 2 weeks old as an administration, but one of the things we've heard President Trump saying is he wants to clean out Gaza and have people who live there relocated to Egypt or Jordan. Obviously, those two countries have firmly rejected that, as has the Arab League. Do you think, just trying to sort of decipher the language and the rhetoric of the Trump administration, do you think he was serious, or do you think he was testing the waters when he touted that plan?
President Trump is, in many ways, a man who finds ways to profit from uncertainty and surprise. That doesn't mean he's not serious. This particular remark had a certain transactional reminiscence of how and in what way real estate people describe what it is they're interested in, a glorification, if you could put it this way, of the weather, the beaches, and the coastline of Gaza. One was brought to mind, whether this is really sound and true or not, that he has some kind of hotel development interest in the process from what he has had to say. Certainly, one has to consider that as being perhaps part of the picture that he envisages with respect to Gaza as he goes ahead. But we'll have to wait and see as that develops, because his capacity to surprise and his capacity to create astonishment with uncertain and rather astounding kinds of statements is all part of his general tactic of finding ways to keep the public, if I could put it this way, engaged but unable further to question him with the wide variety of issues he regularly brings to mind through his management of communications and the press, something that he has shown himself capable of excelling in.
Indeed, we'll have to find out whether or not he was serious. Perhaps we'll find out more as the talks go on between President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu, who, by the way, claims to have redrawn the map here in the Middle East. This, he says, he's done by confronting Iran and its proxies around the region. Would you agree with him? Has he redrawn the map?
No, but I think he's changed political military conditions in a number of ways with his efforts first to try to destroy Hamas. That has not been, according to many military observers, achieved, and it may not be possible. And also the use of force in southern Lebanon against Hezbollah, which has seemingly had some significant effect. Whether it has been the termination of all of their influence and the termination of Iranian influence in a political military sense through people that are often called their proxies, although they don't seem to like that appellation. This may well be part of what we're dealing with now, and it is part of what I believe we are seeing unfold here, but in ways that are, put it this way, not very easy to predict, as the uncertainties of the Middle East are coupled with the processes that are undertaken and the number of challenges that we all face in finding a way to resolve the questions that are out there. Iranian nuclearization, Saudi Arabia reluctance to jump into the arms of Israel in the region, and the concerns that Prime Minister Netanyahu obviously has about termination of the conflict and his right-wing opposition's concerns about that on his part, and the vulnerability he might face for an investigation and recognition of responsibilities with respect to the events of October 7th and the other tragedies that have been caused by force, the use of violence, and so on. One of the key reasons why I think President Trump has adopted a view that war isn't going to solve this problem and it must be ended.
Just lastly, Ambassador, I wanted to ask you for your take on the U.S. Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff, who's emerged as a pretty important figure in the discussions that are taking place in Washington right now, and he's worked closely on the ceasefire deal as well. Tell us a bit about him and what you think he brings to the table with regards to trying to resolve this decades-old problem between Israel and the Palestinians.
I think, Tom, that is a very, very important question. And I did not have the pleasure of knowing Mr. Witkoff at all, but have watched very carefully and felt that he's very wisely dealt with the problem in ways that first are based on promoting compromise and cooperation. The latest step being the one I just noted of the Israelis agreeing to send a delegation to Qatar in the very near future to deal with the second phase discussions that will have to take place if, in fact, this conflict is going to be ended, but also his development of a relationship with the player in the region that is very important with Prime Minister Netanyahu and so on. And we'll have to see how and in what way this negotiating skill and his obvious, I think, capacity to adapt and adopt to the realities of the region, and at the same time to find ways to make forward progress, if only step by step, which may not be an unwise counsel under the current circumstances, mean that he has a contribution to make. And we've already seen that, and should be watched very, very carefully. And I have to tell you that I have found, as someone with a little bit of experience in the region over a number of years, that he seems to be doing quite well. And one hopes that that continues.
Okay, former U.S. Ambassador to Israel, Thomas Pickering, thank you very much indeed for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you. In other news, President Donald Trump has pressed the pause button on the tariffs that he'd threatened to impose on Mexico and Canada. Well, instead of being implemented today, President Trump will review the situation, he says, in 30 days from now. All of this comes after the leader of both countries agreed to toughen up border controls. The Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, says he'll crack down on drug smuggling across the northern border, and he's appointing a special czar to oversee this. Meanwhile, on the southern border, Mexico is immediately reinforcing its border with the United States by deploying 10,000 National Guard troops. Well, let's get more now. We can speak to John Sandweg, former acting director for ICE under President Barack Obama. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, John. I mean, some sighs of relief in Ottawa and Mexico City. Those 25% tariffs that were supposed to take effect today have been paused for 30 days. What have they done to achieve this?
Well, I think what the president did was, by using the threat of economic sanctions and the usage of tariffs to force these concessions as it relates to border security. I think what's interesting, Tom, very quickly, is this again is another example of the Trump administration elevating border security and immigration to the highest priorities of the United States. But more specifically, Mexico promised to deploy National Guardsmen to the northern border there to try to, crack down on the flow of drugs into the United States. And Canada made similar concessions as it relates to border security. So interesting in the sense that the administration's demands to stop the tariffs were focused pretty much exclusively on issues related to border security and immigration.
Okay, and when you hear those steps that are going to be taken by Canada and Mexico, do they sound to you like meaningful steps?
Well, I mean, I think the symbolic value is certainly more significant. 10,000 National Guardsmen at the northern border with Mexico will make an impact. But Tom, you have to understand that Mexico actually is a surprisingly good partner to the United States when it comes to border security. Over the last year, they've done a lot at their southern border to stop the flow of migrants from Central America who are flowing north to the United States. And at the border itself, Mexican law enforcement has always been an incredible partner with U.S. law enforcement in terms of combating the drug cartels and doing cross-border investigations. Now, corruption is a systematic problem in Mexico. So it's a challenge that we face in terms of when we're working law enforcement operations. And there's certain sections of Mexico where there's just the Mexican government really doesn't have operational control of their own region because of the strength of the cartels. But look, 10,000 troops will make a difference. I'm not going to tell you, though, that they've solved the border crisis in the United States by doing that. And the symbolic value, and I think the political, the president's going to claim a political victory here, are probably more impactful than the actual guard, the National Guardsmen will be deployed themselves.
Sure, because of course President Donald Trump has something to show for those words. So as well as those 10,000 frontline officers who are going to help secure the northern border with Canada, Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister, says they'll list drug cartels as terrorists. He's going to appoint a fentanyl czar and crack down on money laundering. I mean, some people might say, weren't those measures long overdue?
Well, I think that one of the mistakes people might make in all of this is to suggest or believe that Canada has not done a lot and is not an incredible partner of the United States. The truth is, the United States has no greater partner when it comes to law enforcement and cross-border investigations than Canada. I think what's interesting, Tom, too, and I think what befuddled a lot of people in the United States is the annual number of seizures of fentanyl, on the U.S. border from Canada are actually exceedingly low. I think a lot of the fentanyl that is illegally imported into Canada stays in Canada. So when you look and compare the volume of seizures of fentanyl between Mexico and Canada, I mean, there's about 100 times, if not more, seizures coming north from Mexico into the United States and from Canada. So I do think people were kind of curious about why the president was kind of putting this kind of robust approach to Canada when the number of seizures are so low and Canada is such an incredible partner. But nevertheless, here we are.
Yeah, it sounds like you, therefore, wouldn't agree with Kevin Hassett, who is the National Economic Council Director, who said this isn't a trade war, it's a drug war. And he was referring to both Canada and Mexico. Sounds like you don't think he's necessarily in agreement with you.
Well, no, I agree that I think the primary purpose here of the president was to force concessions as it relates to border security. I think, look, as it relates to Canada, though, I think there are some misnomers out there about what happens between the U.S.-Canadian border. The reality is that the flow of migrants is very low at that border. The reality also is that the flow of drugs is very low at the border. Certainly, there's cross-border crime, and that's always going to be at any border. But in terms of whatever kind of reasonable definition you have of border security, I think it's fair to say that the U.S.-Canadian border, as vast as it is, Tom, I mean, it's a very large border with, large areas of unincorporated kind of, sections that could be vulnerable to smuggling. But the reality is that there's very little illegal activity, cross-border activity up at that border, certainly as compared to Mexico. But what I do think, again, is interesting, however, is the sheer elevation of border security. We've never seen a political administration in the United States, a president, elevate border security to the absolute pinnacle of U.S. national security priorities. It's always been a third or fourth, an important priority, but not anywhere near where you see a president willing to pull out all the tools available to him economically in order to force what are arguably relatively mild concessions from our trading partners.
Yeah, one of them being, as we've been saying, a fentanyl czar. What would you expect a fentanyl czar to actually have to do?
Tom, anytime you're combating the illegal flow of narcotics, there are really two different kind of functions that you need to do. One is interdiction, and that is your frontline officers who are trying to stop the flow, whether they're inspecting vehicles or monitoring illegal cross-border traffic, so people who are crossing in between the ports of entry. There are a variety of tools there, and in the United States, that is our U.S. Border Patrol, right? They're an interdiction force. They're there to stop smugglers, catch them as they're trying to enter the United States. But really, you can't get this work done effectively unless you also have a robust investigations process. And so I imagine what the fentanyl czar in Canada is going to do is really try to coordinate all of the law enforcement investigatory resources and the prosecutorial resources to try to dismantle the smuggling organizations. And I think critical to that, Tom, is the flow of money, right? All these drug cartels are doing this for profits, that they generate tremendous cash profits. It becomes an incredible challenge for them to launder that money back, clean it and get it back into the economic system. So look, with luck, hopefully here, the U.S., what this will happen was the Canadian, fentanyl czar will now start coordinating even more with the United States law enforcement authorities that kind of have a cohesive, targeted approach to dismantle the cartels. I mean, history has shown us interdiction efforts, 10,000 guardsmen just to stop the frontline smugglers is insufficient. You got to destroy the networks themselves.
Okay, and just in terms of the give and the take in all of this, it wasn't an entirely one-way street because the United States has committed to Mexico will try to limit the flow of guns out of the US into Mexico. But in terms of any other gives from the United States, were there any other concessions made the other way?
I think, look, that is the primary one, but Tom, that is an important one. Historically, most of the US's focus has been on illegal traffic going north into the United States. And people might be surprised. We typically and historically have done very little enforcement on southbound traffic. So people going into Mexico rarely encounter US officials who screen them or document their departure or search for the illicit flow of guns. Typically, Tom, what happens here are guns go south and cash goes south. Drugs and people go north. So, I think Mexico, this has long been a frustration for them. Most of the guns that the cartels, a lot of the guns that cartels utilize and a lot of the guns in Mexico are illicitly trafficked from the United States. The challenge for the US, of course, has been, though, with the kind of the chaos we saw at the border over the last 8 years. We just had huge numbers of people crossing. It really pulls the resources from the Department of Homeland Security, the agency that would be in charge of outbound enforcement, from deploying those troops that we needed to put those Border Patrol agents working in the interior and those CBP officers, handling the influx of people coming across the border. So I think that was a significant concession to the extent that the U.S. steps up on that, and one that frankly really will help kind of dismantle those cartels, as I was saying, in terms of depriving them of some of the cash that they're trying to repatriate and depriving them of the firearms that they smuggle from the United States.
Yeah, and seen from a Mexico point of view, these drug cartels inflict considerable suffering on the people of Mexico themselves, rendering entire towns, entire regions, sort of no-go areas for law enforcement and meaning people live in grave danger. Mexico could argue that if the United States did more to tackle the demand side of things, then there'd be no issue on the supply side. Is the United States doing enough?
I'll tell you, Tom, look, it's obviously an incredibly difficult problem to tackle, but ultimately that is the reason why there's a drug market. That's why the cartels exist, is the U.S. demand for illicit narcotics. And I think that any solution to looking at this problem, you can't just enforce your way out of these problems. You have to tackle this also as a public health crisis. You have to look at tools that can effectively deter people from using narcotics or help them break the cycle of addiction when they're addicted. So, unfortunately, I think one thing we in the United States don't always do well is look at these things in a holistic manner and say, look, we need to attack demand as well as we need to do the investigatory functions to dismantle these cartels and the interdiction function to try to make it harder for them to get drugs here in the first place. But ultimately, of course, the ultimate reason why these cartels are so powerful and why they have so much money is what has proven to be really an insatiable demand for narcotics in the United States and around the world.
As we were saying earlier on, President Trump, of course, will be portraying these steps taken by Canada and Mexico as having been a victory for him. Those two countries are portraying the pause, the sort of the stay of execution, as being a win for them. Clearly, during the next 30 days, there's going to be intense dialogue. Basically, this is just the beginning, isn't it? This sets the scene for some pretty intense negotiations over the next 4 weeks or so.
Yeah, look, I think that this is the beginning of what we're going to see is repeatedly throughout the world with these kind of issues. In the 2 weeks that the president has been in office, he has threatened, a host of tariffs and economic sanctions against Colombia as it relates to taking back their citizens, who are being deported, and now with Mexico. I think in both instances, the president feels as though he achieved substantial political wins and forced concessions from the Canadians and Mexicans and the Colombians. I suspect that we're going to see these tools again and again and again, that the president's going to seek to force concessions from other countries with the threat of tariffs. I would not be surprised, even if in 30 days we work out a more comprehensive settlement with Canada and Mexico, there's nothing that prevents the president from re-threatening these tariffs against them again. So I do think that it is going to be very interesting over the next 3 years to see to the extent to which the president seeks to leverage the threat of tariffs to force concessions on an array of issues, but obviously of paramount importance to them has been anything related to migration and border security.
Just lastly, some of America's allies, and we've been talking about Canada and Mexico as being, not just neighbors, but also important allies, they view all of this rhetoric, all of these threats as being, to use one of the words being used by Canadian officials, chaotic. Do you think that once the dust has settled, this will be revealed to have been a stroke of genius on the part of the Trump administration?
I think that's going to be the ultimate question. There's a cost you pay for this. So you announce you're putting in place 25% tariffs. What I don't think people see is that all the U.S. businesses who there's a lot of U.S. manufacturing that's based in Mexico. The U.S. has long enjoyed, trade agreements, free trade agreements with Mexico. Businesses have built their businesses, invested billions of dollars into putting production in Mexico. And so when suddenly these tariffs are put in place, those businesses are scrambling, and then suddenly the tariffs are taken off. So I guess the question that people are going to have to judge as this goes forward is that chaos in the United States, and is that impact and that chilling effect it has economically worth the gains we're getting in terms of the deployment of 10,000 troops? I will say this, that Mexico has actually done quite a bit, especially over the last year. During the tail end of the Biden administration, the number of people crossing that border illegally dropped dramatically. It went down from roughly 250,000 per month to 50,000 per month. Drug seizures went down as well. Mexico's always been a great partner in terms of law enforcement investigations at the border. So I think that squeezing additional gains out of Mexico, and some of this is tackling a problem that is a much different problem than the one the president campaigned on, but it does come at a cost, and it'll be interesting to see whether that chaos and the business community's frustration with this kind of stop and start approach ultimately is worth the gains we make.
Okay, we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much for your time. John Sandweg, former acting director for ICE. Thank you very much indeed. That is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, goodbye.